Hello everyone, today we talk about the Mauryan army organization and more extensively about the military of the Indian powers between roughly the mid-4th and the mid-2nd century BC. And of course, as you know, the Mauryan Empire was the major poly at this time. Didn't last very long, after all, just a century and a half, but fundamentally representing one of the largest military powers of the time, and also in ancient history, and for which it is in fact rightfully remembered. Today we will talk specifically about its military organization, right? We will not deal with tactics directly, explicitly. We will focus fundamentally on chiefly of what we know from Greek sources, right? Because the majority of information that we have, unfortunately, is not from the same Indian background, but from the Hellenistic diplomatic missions, etc. And we will try, of course, from this point of view, also to broaden the picture in talking about the military culture of the Mauryan Empire, and the very composite one that India as a subcontinent in fact already had, but also the influences of the surrounding peoples, notably in the northwest, of course, and also we will observe naturally some same native Indian sources as well, and this is a big chapter, so it's obvious that we will come back on it on other dedicated videos, because there is really a lot to say. I think that the Indian military culture in this, we can say Hellenistic times, saying from our kind of more Western perspective, is extremely fascinating. It was in contact, indeed, as we said before, with the Alexandrine military culture. Alexander arrived in India, as we know, Seleucus first invading it again and going possibly, for what we can understand, even further than what Alexander himself had gone. And this satellites, that is maybe it's not really the best term to use, but let's say the idea that as most of the Indian history in general, the greatest powers were concentrated, as you know, in the north, between the Indus and Ganges valleys, right? And that were the most fertile areas. It's a huge, if you just look at India from the satellite, in fact, and look at what it is. Aside from the size, which is huge, but look at the color. It's dark green. I mean, it's an enormous, and I mean an enormous field, a fertile land that in fact could provide these enormous agricultural resources that sustained military systems like these ones. And there is no surprise that basically every Western power that came close to it, or even just in the Middle East, wanted to push eastwards to invade India, because this enormous agricultural basin could have sustained enormous political and military power, and this is what Alexander wanted. You know, if he hadn't died, he probably would have subjugated Arabia, and then eventually possibly also Carthage, but the ultimate end was India, and it was obvious. If you look at the sheer dimensions involved in here, it's self-evident why this was the case. The Romans wished that Augustus wanted to conquer India, for example. Of course, the Romans never got even close to do that, but still, this great subcontinent, as a matter of fact, I can't stress this enough, was seen as the problem solver, theoretically at least, for all the major powers of the time. As you know, India in modern and contemporary history had its own European domination, from which the British emerged victorious. So it remained this great pole of attraction, and an area, of a region of great civilization. I mean, but you can find, complex, think about urbanization in the history of mankind. It's essentially the Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China. All between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile, the Indus and the Ganges and the Yellow River. This is what where human civilization spread mostly from. It actually spread chiefly from Mesopotamia and Egypt, almost in parallel, telling the truth. But these areas were very advanced. I mean, you can find advanced sewer systems in Indian cities since the third millennium BC. I mean, it's something like that. Just for saying how the systems that eventually were to lag behind in a certain sense, because when Alexander invaded it, the Westerners were already pretty advanced and had a pretty structured political and social systems that produced even a military that was regarded by the same Indians not recommended to meet in open field, right? So a lot to talk about theoretically, and today we do it chiefly from the, let's say, organizational point of view, or this broader, let's say, management, at least of local resources that could allow such a huge army like the Mauryan one to exist. Of course, two premises that are very important. In all this video, we will essentially we have to look at the military developments of the Mauryans as a process of centralization of Indian political and military culture that was already started by the predecessors of the Mauryans, but definitely under the founder Chandragupta and his grandson Ashoka made the greatest advancements in that was brutally accelerated in a certain sense. Because India was a pretty complex system with actually a very heterogeneous political and military culture. There were kingdoms and even cities or tribes or other communities, federations. So it was an enormous territory with initially a relatively scarce centralization, especially outside of the most fertile areas. That was very difficult to keep together. Essentially, in fact, also the Mauryan Empire would disaggregate in less than 2 centuries. So that's also pretty meaningful. But at the same time, there is a that, as it happens actually very often in military history, is a pretty homogeneous background in terms of military practice, right? If you look at Indian armies, there were sensible differences in regard to their administration, but not particularly in terms of tactics or technology. Technology was actually important, especially for the greatest kingdoms and empires for obvious reasons, as centralized powers usually invest even in technology, also especially in siege warfare, etc. There is all a debate, whether even siege engines were used or not. We'll see it today in part. But the most important thing is realizing the effort that bringing such big armies on the field entailed, right? And obviously, secondly, we have pretty unreliable information about how large these armies were. I mean, we know they were huge, but always know as an elementary military notion that, especially in the ancient world, you can't command an army on the field that is larger than 50,000 men. I mean, it's literally impossible. There's never been a single army in the history of mankind during those times that surpassed 50,000. I say this because it's full of imbeciles, frankly, that every time that they see, there is their own country paraded somewhere, they think, oh yeah, this is my country, so cool, it was so huge and immense. And when they read sources that write gross overestimations, like saying armies of 600,000, they actually believe those are true, while every person who has at least a minimal, like an elementary, an ABC understanding of military history, every idiot that can approach this topic knows that that's radically false, right? And there is no debate whatsoever on this, right? And there can't be, too, because if there was, it would be an insult to the dignity of the average human intelligence, which is something we should try to avoid. So this is valid for every single country out there. This is not about India, but I talk about India here because indeed the numbers that we have for these armies are pretty big, right? So you will rarely find them elsewhere, which means that in part it is true that these armies were quite big. From the other, there is obviously a boastful attitude towards the idea of presenting, of course, a large army, an immense army, having if you know something about Indian civilization and culture and religion, you find this enormous emphasis posed on the enormity of the physical movement, enormous swarms of human beings. India already at the time had a pretty massive population, and there is a great emphasis on this that is framed within a hierarchy. Think about the social classes, right? About this hierarchy or also the various deities, divinities. So this is part of Indian culture to project this enormous masses of people that naturally in this perspective were framed under a political military power that was of Aryan origin, of course. Here there was an extremely, the Vedic India was probably the most radically violent Aryan domination. Like the Indian castes were, pretty tight in terms of, in fact, social mobility, etc. And the reason being in part that by the time of the Aryan migrations, India was already pretty massively developed. So this emphasis posed on the fact that the conquerors were these few brave warriors that managed to rule over these masses of inferiors, because this was literally what the conception was at the time. It was maintained for an enormous time, right? When the Aryans instead migrated into Europe, they found relatively, on average, at least, less developed civilizations. Some were largely tribal people, so they kind of adapted to. They were at the same level. They didn't feel there was an inherent difference in that sense. So you don't find, at least, there's not even if we know that, of course, Aryan culture brought to the subjugation of peoples initially in this kind of division, these things exist. If you look at ancient Rome, there are blatant marks of this Aryan division. The idea that were the Aryan warriors that had conquered this, and the rest were the plebs, were, other things. They were basically even couldn't be soldiers as such, as freemen, as warriors, right? There is something here in India still at this time too, right? This is pretty late compared to Aryan invasions, but still there was an enormous military ethos imbued with the sense of heroic, of these heroic military figures that had, of champions and fighters, of warriors that that was perceived, however, and this is very interesting, at a political level, at the point that we will see it, especially with those communities that Greece thought, when they went in India, they thought they were kind of, in fact, like their own polis, conceptually, although even the local cities were something very different, because they were all freemen, right? And even if, of course, they weren't of Aryan descent, at least the majority of them, still they felt the idea that as long as you were free, you had to be a warrior, and that was pretty obvious, because those communities were pretty clanic, tribal in character, and they that concept was functional to their own ideal. And it also depends, in fact, on the landscapes, on the environments. Like it's obvious that even geographically speaking, the Aryans had come from the north, that had remained more savage mountaineer communities that were also pretty blurred. Like the borders of in northwest India here are pretty unstable, and there were many other peoples, including the first will come the Bactrians, then eventually the Scythians once again, hence other Aryans from the very spring of the steppes. So this is a very interesting story, but you also find something else, that of course it wasn't just the case of the warriors that could fight now, or that did fight, right? The Mauryan elite needed a lot of non-warriors into their ranks, but they were treated differently, etc. And there is also an interesting relation between, in this sense, the Hellenic invaders, let's say, at one point, and this recognition of Aryanity, in the sense that, for example, the Greeks settled in this, after Alexander's conquest in these lands, like between today's Afghanistan and Pakistan, that were controlled by the Maurya at one point, but that's a complicated story. But some Greeks had remained there, and there was the contested border with the Seleucids, but also some settlements for which, for example, the women of the warrior caste in India, they were the most important just after the Brahmins, when the priesthood could marry, for example, the Hellenic settlers, but not, for example, the Mauryan soldiery, lower of the outside of the caste of the of the warriors. So that's very important, because you understand that these troops largely, even were mostly levies, presumably, were considered still as something separate, but still they were armed, interestingly enough. So you understand how this division between the Aryans and the locals had, had vanished largely, and from a strictly ethnical point of view, but from a political point of view, from a military point of view, so a social point of view, was still what the whole concept revolved all around still, and would remain in India, because frankly, there are still these divisions there. So Vedic India is also very fascinating. Maybe one day we should start talking about history of religions a little bit to understand this better, because that would clarify a lot of things. But for now, we stick to the Mauryan army, and fundamentally observing that it is very difficult to talk about it and to ascertain certain aspects of his organization, as much as of other Indian armies that were not Mauryan of this time. Because aside from the invaluable Hellenic testimony, the written evidence is mostly of uncertain date. We don't know whether it's in fact original from Mauryan times. For example, the main single source is the Arthasastra, which is a manual on government that is very interesting, because it's a manual of realpolitik, if you want. It's very close conceptually, also in this bit of Eastern mindset. I don't want to stress parallelisms, but a bit the idea of Sun Tzu, this very pragmatic oriented political practice that was also, as we reminded before, extremely violent. The idea you get from this is that these rulers had to rule an enormous amount of people, and this equated, if they rebel, I can say it's a manual of counterinsurgency, but it deals pretty pragmatically and probably effective, reflecting Mauryan political practice pretty effectively in the local affairs, right? And it talks about a lot of things, including, in fact, government and warfare, right? And this work, the Arthasastra, is attributed to Kautilya, who was the minister of Chandragupta Maurya, who ruled between 321 and 297 BC. That is the greatest of the Mauryan rule. The founder of the dynasty had Chandragupta. He's an amazing historical character. If you read his story, you realize a lot about this. Just think that he fled India at a point before becoming Indian emperor. Because he had headed this revolt to against local rule, and he was already a very powerful figure, and he fled India, and he joined Alexander the Great, who was at the time conquered the Achaemenid Empire, And by the way, there is a massive Achaemenid influence, Persian influence into India and into Mauryan political culture specifically. And Chandragupta, at that point, he shared. So here we're talking about high levels. Alexander the Great wasn't just the sometimes I hate sometimes how even in the West we consider Alexander the Great sometimes just as an adventurer that was the cool guy who just conquered without, just about war, right? And not understanding the immensity of such mind and such figure and his political, historical, religious meaning, the mythology that Alexander has left, the symbol that stretched from all over the world. Probably in Muslim lands, actually Alexander the Great is considered a much greater hero, has a much greater, impact in local culture than even in the Western world, which is pretty strange if you think about it. But it's not when you understand the story. And here we're talking about universal rulers. Alexander was, without any possible comment, the single greatest commander in the history of the world. I mean, there is the minimal debate about this. Just stating the contrary is a declaration of historical illiteracy. There is nothing you can say against it. It's immense. No sensible person would try to venture into the mind of Alexander more than much, because you would get lost into that. And Chandragupta was, in a certain sense, someone who wished to parallel this power, wished to establish, in fact, something that, if not greater, was, in parallel, this great universal rule in the same Indian soil. And thinking about these great minds and their different vision of the world, also is very fascinating, because, for example, when Alexander's army mutinied at the gates of India, where he wanted to push them forward, Chandragupta was shocked by seeing that Alexander decided to go back because of it, because in his mindset was habituated with the idea of castes, right? A king doesn't need anyone's permission to lead power. Not even this his soldiery, his fellow Macedonian peers, let's say. It was completely inconceivable. In fact, Chandragupta was disgusted by this, just for telling you here the levels of greatness to which these political cultures were inspired to. Like the idea that this could we can't know what Chandragupta's mind was thinking like, but you can understand here they didn't left each other well, because Chandragupta basically considered Alexander like not a true leader at that point. You can understand the arrogance, but the self-entitlement that this Vedic legacy had left in here. The idea that command and power is divine, and you can't share it with anyone else, right? Alexander, in all his immensity, as we said before, was still, however, pragmatically oriented towards, if your army doesn't want to proceed, how can you, in the story of Alexander, we know that he was kind of obliged to go back. He understood, at least, the moral of his men. And we see it as a pragmatic thing, but objectively was a great blow, and it was perceived by this more absolutistic-minded rulers. That in fact India, in this sense, was way more stratified and aristocratic and monarchically oriented country than Macedon. Macedon was a fairly poor country with this feudal aristocracy of peers that now, from which the Alexander's dynasty had emerged from relatively previous times. They had exploited what the situation was in the Balkans, in Thrace, in Greece, etc. And this allowed them to eventually to produce also the military system that allowed Saint Alexander to invade the Achaemenid Empire, which was considered also from the Hellenic dimension the universal empire. Never forget this, that also as Westerners we have depicted this idea that the Greeks somewhat felt themselves as separated from the Achaemenid Empire, but because eventually they won the Persian wars, etc. But technically, probably most of the Greeks before those wars even had thought of themselves, including the Macedons, that also were considered borderline by the peoples from Athens, from the core, let's say, of Hellenic culture, like more as barbarians. But they had been all Achaemenid subjects. They thought themselves in the Achaemenid Empire that in those times, by sheer size and power, was obviously and incontrovertibly the world's empire. It ruled objectively all over the world, and not the world that we think it is today, the world, but that time's world, that was something very different. So this strong and deeply religious and spiritual political cultures were all one, right? You can't interpret the ancient world thinking that these were secularized sovereigns. Everything was exclusively and solely based on religion, and you couldn't go out of this. So and even in fact the symbolism that the Mauryans adopted in India was massively influenced by the same Achaemenid one. For example, the great lion statues that you find scattered all over India from Mauryan times are in fact a Persian legacy. They come from the idea of the lion and symbol of fire, of sacred fire, immortality, that actually existed also into Vedic culture. Because hey, they were all Aryans, right? They came all from the steppes. Cyrus the Great was objectively a Scythian, right? There is no doubt about this either by any standard. These guys came all from the same center, same stock. It's somewhat ridiculous how we tend to draw these lines, like saying, oh no, that was, I don't know, that was another thing. Those were Iranians, those were Scythians. That they were literally the same identical thing. In the moment in which they migrated, of course, into the Iranian plateau, then they changed, they differed, just like the Indians had. This is obvious, but the root is the same, and this broad, in fact, as what we call Indo-Aryan, because actually, or Indo-European, because the world is exactly this enormous crescent that stretches from the Atlantic to the Ganges Valley, that and even beyond, because the Tokharians, for example, arrived as far as China. Were dominated by this essentially chivalric culture of the Aryans coming from the steppes that were the authors of the greatest changes in history. The Achaemenid Empire was an Aryan empire, was founded as such. The Vedic Empire, Vedic India, there was no real political continuity as we see here, but in terms of polities of empire, etc., that they were overthrown, etc. But as we've seen, the castes were always there. The concepts were all the same. So I stress very much these things because I realize that more than the numbers or the pathetic attempt from the modern mind to reduce all to material elements, if you want to understand these worlds, you have first and foremost to understand their spirituality and their culture, because war and politics in this world have no sense without those. And let's eradicate violently from our mind that these worlds can be understood, studied, explored, refusing things like religion or by applicating modern categorizations, and because it's better to do something else in that place, because otherwise it's time wasted, right? So the we were talking about Chandragupta in himself, so of the Arthasastra, right, as a work, and this is there was attributed, as we've seen, to Kautilya, the minister of Chandra Gupta. So theoretically, one of the great minds were behind the organization of the Mauryan Empire from a factual point of view. But the problem we have with the Arthasastra is that we have enormous difficulties with the traditional attribution. Because as a matter of fact, the Arthasastra does not much use the Mauryan official terminology. Right? It does use, however, later terms, while its account of military administration differs, in some respects at least, from the eyewitness testimony of Megasthenes. For example, it was the Seleucid ambassador to Chandragupta. Today, this work is considered rather as a mixture of actual Mauryan, but also mostly later material, right? Basham's opinion is that the Arthasastra is an elaboration of a Mauryan original, which was perhaps, as a matter of fact, the work of Kautilya himself, but about which there is no certainty, right? And the timeline here varies wildly, and just think also about this literary culture that was extremely imbued with a sense of tradition, of legacy, of perpetuation. In India there are all these great cyclical ideas of the world, and even the construction of these texts are to be understood as very built up progressively, right? Think about even the Mahabharata, the most important epic poem of India. The Mahabharata is a beautiful read. There are certain passages about it, and about also military edits that are amazing. I mean, it's like reading the Iliad, in the Indian version. This work also contains, in fact, these great conditions. There is an idea of, that destiny has, that especially castes are inescapable. That humans, even heroes, have a role in this world. They cannot escape. If you are a warrior, you shouldn't wonder what you should do with more. You are a warrior. That's what you're meant to be, and fighting is all what you have to do, and not thinking much about else theoretically. This is it already makes you understand what the mindset, the tracks of these peoples were. They're obviously different from our own, as they were, frankly, very, very difficult from the same Hellenistic ones that were also looking at this reality. The Hellenistic culture had already, absorbed this Hellenic, if you want, rationality and in part also secularization. I mean, secularization, of course, always exists in a certain measure. The Greeks had been the first ones who had started reasoning in terms like, looking at a tree, and a Persian would have seen in that tree exclusively that particular tree with all its meaning, all magical value and spirit and particular. It was that tree and not anyone, something else, and there was nothing like that. And the Greeks started seeing that tree just like, they started wonder, at least conceptually, methodologically, and rationally as a consequence, whether is there something in common to all trees? Like, are there certain categories that we can applicate, right? And therefore there is a much more rational orientation, and objectively this culture's lacked. I do believe, there was a phase of my life in which, when I was a bit younger, also started studying at university, I understood the greatness of these civilizations outside my own, in the past as well as in the present, and therefore I started saying, we are not better in the sense that, it doesn't make sense to compare them in terms of, if you want to make a a rank of them, and this is what I still believe. But objectively, I do think that the Western civilization, because of Hellenic thought and philosophy and all what evolved from that, and this rationalization, had really a greater understanding of reality, of historical reality. You know, the Hellenic historiography is something that started a tradition that in these countries in the East, like in China, and it was not present. The Muslims got a bit of this, like the Persians in part were something like, well, of course the Muslims were bred with Hellenistic education fundamentally, but also Persian one, and massively Persian one, and the Persian one is also very, very important because it's kind of halfway in some ways between the Hellenic rationale and this more mystical take on the world from the East. But it's you know, you don't have an Herodotus in these worlds. You don't have Thucydides. You don't have Xenophon. Those are sources that tell you what history is without, with a rational cause effects chain of reasoning, right? These worlds do not have this. That is, it's not that they were stupid. They weren't at all. They were pretty damn smart. But the point is that they didn't need to produce that vision of the world in order to make their own work the way it did. Now, we will have to make an enormous video about this at one point, because we could talk for entire days about this stuff. But what I would like to make you understand is that you can't judge, even if we lack a precise, spot-on information about these realities, and we deem this world as seemingly chaotic or incomprehensible. Actually, that's where we fail in part as Westerners to understand. We have to stay open in the measure in which say, okay, we have to take this apparent confusion as exactly the most important part of this information, and understanding what this system could be functional like, so that we can understand how it worked as well. And it's very difficult. It's a very difficult mental exercise. You don't get out of all of it so simply. Possibly, it's impossible to try to understand these minds, or anybody's minds for that matter. But even this vision of the world can tell you a lot about what the political military practice of these powers really was, right? So the Mahabharata specifically describes a war which took place basically not really in contemporary times, in mythical past, let's say, but probably, certain people say it's not historical. Really, it doesn't talk about actual history. That's always dangerous to say, because it's like saying even that the Iliad is not historical. Of course, it's largely invented, but still, it refers to a context that was pretty much real as a culture. So it's always historical, and the Mahabharata overall reflects the heroic aristocratic spirit of an earlier era's warfare. Right. That's why it fits so well with the Iliad in comparison, because objectively, that came out from the outside of the Hellenic Middle Ages as into a world that eventually rationalized that thing. But it was paradoxically how those previous centuries had thought reality like, and these are very composite texts. There are also massive works telling the truth. And they're beautiful reads. Once again, if you have the opportunity to read them, please do it. Maybe one day we will make a video about it. However, in fact, the Mahabharata could have been composed gradually in a time span of 400 years, like between 200 BC to 200 AD, right? So much later, of course, even of the Mauryans. And of course, probably having existed as a informal oral tradition, probably from much before. So it's not contemporary, but there is also to say that probably this world had not changed so radically. Probably there are many exaggerations, and of course, once again, we should all be kind of anthropologically oriented and versed and educated about I don't know, this ancient Indian culture to fully understand what all those things meant. But still, it's not that this world's changed so dramatically after all, and especially if we are interested into the military technicalities, you can read that with some benefit even of, if not of concreteness, at least of certain analogic information you can derive from the contents. So with caution, we can use this work as well. So looking at the Indian landscape from which the Mauryan Empire rose, 4th century India was divided into this myriad of small political entities. We have defined it. Some, on average, it was still a tribal world. On average, right? As we've defined it before, there were mostly these kingdoms, sometimes larger, becoming ruling on others, hence becoming empires. But there are also certain urban centers, certain scattered tribes, federations of all these groups put together, right? The northern area of India mostly was had inherited the political legacy of the Aryan tribes that had invaded India back in the day, and the largest and these in the north, in fact, you can find the most structured powers, mostly monarchies, right? The largest of these monarchies had been the Magadha, in the Ganges Valley, that had been ruled by the Nanda dynasty, and in fact was the notable predecessor of the Mauryan Empire. Actually, there were many predecessors to the Mauryans, not just the Nanda Empire, but also the Mahayanapada, the Magadha we've talked about here, the Pauravas, Taxila as well. It was the city-state, emerged into the Achaemenid period as well, that the Mauryans also, with the disgregation of the Persian Empire and the contraction of the Diadoches powers, kind of they actually destroyed Taxila. Taxila in today's Pakistan is an amazing archaeological site. Just look at its ruins; it's amazing, and it controlled at one point basically the entire Indus Valley. It was very powerful. It stretched over to today's territories of Afghanistan, Pakistan, parts of India. It was a great power. So there were all these polities that, of course, always coexisted. An empire is not, as I often say, a Victorian empire. It's not a national state. An empire in the ancient world is this faculty of power that allows you to control various communities that are all remain largely with their own customs and traditions, etc. And it's based on military deterrence, how can you control them? And in these powers in the north were more structured, essentially because they had more resources available, locally speaking, so there was more agricultural surplus, in short, and in fact, best organizable political, territorial dominations, let's say. This is where the major centers had risen in general as cities, etc. And they and also the territory in general was richer, was better connected to trade routes with other areas. There was also relatively different environments were also closer. The forests were closer, so for timber. Elephants mostly grazing there. It was also an attraction point, of course, from other communities of mercenaries. Mercenaries had a great importance into India. It also came sometimes from abroad. Even though India in itself was a relatively isolated system, like it was, in fact, as we have defined it, this massive agricultural basin that more or less developed in kind of original forms, right, on its own as a civilization, as a culture. And about 321 BC, a Magadhan exile that was no less than Chandragupta Maurya eventually overthrew the Nanda at the head of an alliance with several powers, including the most powerful of which was the one headed by King Parvataka, that possibly could be identified with Porus, King Porus, the one of the Battle of Hydaspes, when was still allied with Alexander the Great, because Alexander the Great actually, as we've seen, backed Chandragupta, and this was a moment in which this alienation, let's say, aligning of powers had produced, in fact, Chandragupta to rise to power over the Nanda rulers, right? So the Mauryan kingdom expanded eventually under Chandragupta. His son Bindusara, and especially his grandson Ashoka, extended Mauryan rule almost all over India, except the far south, that however was reduced to vassalage, basically, as client states, right? But the south of India, as you know, is kind of the wildest area, and also maybe one of the least profitable ones also to control in part. But it was still important for trade with the Far East Asia. But it's not that also the locals could oppose much of a resistance. Like, I don't know if you realize what it meant at the time to control the entire India in terms of political and military deterrence. Like, it's a massive power, and it's an unprecedented one actually in the area, in the region. So after it was Ashoka's, Chandragupta is the greatest ruler. Ashoka, his grandson, also as great conqueror that expanded the Mauryan power. However, after Ashoka's death in 232 BC, the empire began to fragment, and in 180, Magadha itself was the capital, fell to Pushyamitra Zunga, a general of Ashoka himself, that whom he martyred, in fact, and he was a Brahmin and sponsored, say, a traditionalist reaction against the Buddhism of the late Mauryas, right? This had began. Actually, it's possible that Chandragupta had converted to Jainism. In fact, he seemingly died in after having retired in a monastic state due to fasting, right? And Ashoka also had the Mauryans had expanded this Buddhist ideal that, as you know, is pretty opposite to what the caste tradition is based on. It's kind of a universal message of liberation from the same humanity, from the same earthly character. I know it's very complex, but it's somewhat a denial of the need of a civilization. The caste system wasn't quite a great thing either, as you know, it has a direct consequence, but at least it reflected a real, the reality of political and social certification, and it would be interesting to deepen the reasons that brought the Mauryas to embrace Buddhism and trying to express it as a religion of state through their edicts, etc. But it's somewhat probably due to the trying to of homogenizing and kind of lowering maybe of the most powerful aristocrats. That's how I see it. And naturally this couldn't go unnoticed, especially by the Brahmin class that was one of the priests that naturally defended its own establishment, and so on. And eventually the northwest of India fell to the Greeks, right, with the Bactrian power extending onto the Indus Valley, and followed also by the Sakas eventually. This Scythian rulers that established, in fact, a pretty solid kingdom, always in the northwest, and this northern invasions and collapse of the Mauryan power also intensified the power of the Deccan Dynasties. The Deccan area was traditionally, can say, a competitor of the great northern kingdoms, but of course was the one where, you know, that shared somewhat different political cultures and practices, simply because, you know, it was a less stratified area. It was a more tribal character of power, a greater egalitarianism, and this sense that, you know, the big powerful north with the great river basins, etc., could move this massive armies. In the Deccan powers in the south, they were poorer but kind of still more individually warlike in a certain sense as tribal powers. Compared to the great empires of the north, right? You know, it's something that sparked enormous debate, because also of the relation, like some said, that the Deccan areas was less Aryan in character, but also in here it seemingly wasn't, telling the truth. I mean, it's possible, of course, that Aryan influence, Vedic influence was greater in the north, but still the Deccan powers are fundamentally a result of the like Vedic culture in general, of the mix between the Aryans and the local cultures, right? So it's controversial and debatable in general. And among the Deccan dynasties, we mentioned the Andhra or Satavahana kings that also were responsible for building one of the major sources on the appearance of Indian troops of the time. There are the reliefs at Sanchi that I also inserted here in the pictures of the video. So, talking about finally about the Indian armies as such. So there were seemingly four arms in the Mauryan armies: infantry, cavalry, chariots, and elephants. Of course, you know, chariots and elephants can fit into the arm of cavalry as well, but still here had a substantial importance on their own. So infantry, as you can imagine, in this overwhelmingly populated country was the most numerous, right? And it is normal basically for every sedentary civilization. Let's say the chariots and the elephants instead, and especially the former, were however the most prestigious element of the army, also the most expensive, as you can imagine. So the Mahabharata gives proportions of 1 elephant to 1 chariot, 3 cavalry and 5 infantry, in a theoretical arrangement that, counting it in percentage, would be like containing 2 men per chariot and 3 men per elephant, although the crew sizes varied for sure. We can say it was 23 elephant crew, 15% charioteers, 23% cavalry, and 38% infantry, right? So it's a fairly balanced proportion that makes you understand anyway the importance of the mounted element in here, and especially of the elephants, if you think about it, right? Not just in terms of the most obvious shock function of elephant charges, but also of firepower, combined with guys on the turrets. Chariots are also fairly important. Chariots are in this moment still present in ancient warfare, but they have somewhat declined in other areas. As we've seen, the Persians usually used that, but in the Iron Age, fundamentally, chariots had become fewer and larger, right? Because they weren't the extremely maneuverable and lighter vehicles of the Bronze Age, where infantries were too weak to withstand first the arrow shower and eventually the charge. Now infantries had become tougher, and therefore chariots were kind of useless frontally against them. So they had grown larger and used just in very peculiar situation. I made a video about the Battle of Dachylium that talks about that. I commanded chariots versus Hellenic phalanx, and there is but the chariot has remained anyway a prerogative of some tribal powers around the world. For example, in Central Europe, and there are still chariots. In North Africa, there are still chariots, right? And the warfare there was not particularly developed like the European or North African chariotry would never reach the levels of Assyria or the first Assyrian Empire, or of Egypt, etc. They were kind of less dynamic. But here in India, seemingly they remained. Usually the chariot is the indicator of a warrior/heroic culture. Chariots, even in India, had seemingly grown larger over time. They were massive shock trust, formation trusting things conceptually. So it's just this massive thing launched at great speed against enemy formation with great mass, right? Of course, chariots are slower than the cavalry, but still they have much greater mass. And India was not actually very good, and still is not in general for horse breeds, right? And in fact, cavalry was usually very expensive and imported as well. But still, we find that 23% of cavalry, which was very meaningful. Its ratio 23% to 15% with chariots, charioteers, that would be 23% to 5% in terms of chariots proper. It's still a relatively low proportion, right? Still, chariots are important, and they're probably more important than in other military contexts, even in the Middle East. And the infantry, it's less than 40% in terms of personnel, at least, and it's important as well because in such armies you would expect infantry could be even in present in larger amounts, but the tendency, as we will see now, is that fundamentally the Mauryan Empire had a standing army that they tended to professionalize in avoiding large masses of conscripts to join, if not in moments of emergency. So this is very important because it gives you also a dimension of the financiary, like the sheer amount of resources for fielding even thousands of elephants sometimes. Okay, maybe thousands is too much, but still having hundreds of elephants, logistically speaking, it's incredible. It's simply incredible at some levels. So the Arthasastra's unit compositions instead imply similar proportions, and the Hellenistic sources as well. We have several recorded armies, including the one of Porus, for example, which, at least following Arian and including the advance force bidden before the main battle against Alexander, included 200 elephants, which altogether make a 1.5% of the total army. and having a crew of 3, 420 chariots with a 6.5% with a crew of 6, which is attested by Curtius, 6,000 cavalry, which make 15%, and 30,000 infantry, which make a 77%. So here, infantry is probably realistically more numerous, right? Although here we also talk about areas that are a bit different from the one of the Mauryans proper, because there is a geography here to take into account. Porus ruled over a kingdom that was fundamentally in the northwest of India. It wasn't. It was considered peripheral, and probably cavalry, in fact, had a smaller importance, as we will see later. The last Nanda king, in fact, is credited also, at least taking into account the lower figures, because as we said at the beginning, there are massive exaggerations, with 3,000 elephants, 2,000 chariots, 20,000 cavalry, and 200,000 infantry, which is ridiculously false, as we stated pretty clearly at the beginning of the video. But these numbers are, however, very meaningful, because they show fundamentally a decimal base implied. 2,000 chariots, 20,000 cavalry, 200,000 infantry, right? It's 1 per 10 per 10, right? Which is realistic. It's fairly realistic, and probably decimal system was more widespread than the sources more theoretically show. The number of 3,000 elephants in this sense is, maybe just showing that elephants were more important than chariots, right? Which is also plausible. By the way, here the idea is immediately that the elephants seem like the spearhead of the army, and then the chariots would follow after them to exploit the disorder. Consider that Indian armies were pretty symmetrical in the sense, so they fought mostly, however, with elephants in the first line or on the wings against each other. So even this spearhead was probably the most important part and of the army. And interestingly enough, the Greek authors state that Porus elephants were more numerous as well as fiercer in his realm than in the West, right? And Chandragupta is said to have conquered India with 600,000 men, and to have ruled eventually with an army of 9,000 elephants, 30,000 horse, and 600,000 infantry. So here we see also another decimal base, at least 1 to 20 in cavalry and infantry ratio, and elephants are even less than cavalry, right? But still, considering these numbers that of course are impossible, I mean, here it would be like 1 elephant per not even 4 horses. So it's still, elephants still have an enormous importance. Here we're not talking about crews, we're talking about the single animals, right? So it's really, really impressive, and this probably tells us that elephants were pretty damn important overall, even over cavalry. Interestingly enough, here chariots are not recorded, but we don't have to be too dogmatic either, as proportions varied quite widely in general, and there could be as many cavalry, for example, for per 5 or per 20 infantry. And adding chariots and elephants together, there could be like 1 per 30 or per 2 per 50 infantry, right? So but these are still big numbers, like, because it's once again, they appear as well-balanced tactical proportions, but at the same time, you get the impression that elephants and cavalry were perceived as more important than infantry. And the fact that also cavalry was so expansive and that India normally doesn't quite have much of it, so it makes you understand if there were such fairly high numbers of cavalry, because this is not really a few, right, excluding even elephants, etc. You realize that that this mounted element was probably quite prestigious in itself. I mean, it was considered an effective arm, because otherwise it would have not been used. I mean, if infantry had done most of the job, what do you use cavalry for? I considered that in these times, also elsewhere, cavalry is important. In general, infantry, however, still wins. So India is probably a military environment to which cavalry has probably a leading role overall. And we'll try to see this better maybe in other videos, but here it's what the impression is. Also because elephants and chariots are meant to, in fact, not to support infantry, but to stay in front of it and to do most of the job. Right? Well, infantry mostly has just to follow. This is typical of aristocratic military cultures, which the Indian one actually was, as we have seen. So, historically speaking, we tend to think that certain military cultures that made more use of infantry were mostly about infantry. I mean, numerically speaking, were mostly about infantry. So this is actually false. Many people consider that cavalry, in fact, can be measured just in terms of numbers. It's not exclusively like that. And in the Indian case, you can't do both things, in the sense that cavalry, the mounted element overall, is pretty numerous, and also its local military culture gives a great importance probably to the mounted element. Consider that the Vedic culture had stemmed from the steppes, from the equestrian tradition. So even if India had been cut off from that, not entirely, but as a system had kind of developed largely within itself, but still this culture remained, and you can find this also in other military cultures that are mostly conceived as purely infantry based, right? Think about the Romans. Everybody believes that the Romans had kind of poor cavalry, or that they didn't care about cavalry, because they never actually studied Roman military culture. They just look at the number of cavalry in the legions, and they say, okay, well, it was all about the legionnaire and it's the idea of citizen soldier. No, it was not. It was not. And this is also because we forgot about the origins of these peoples largely, and we often don't understand how much care was placed in cavalry, even when this was, and especially I would say when this was not largely available. India is a proof of this, telling the truth. So what could we say? In terms of costs, just think about this. An elephant costs surely more than 30 people, right? Even if you have, we don't just have to think it in terms of size or of how much they eat, but also in all what it takes to train them, to make them work properly, right? But still, the elephant has this massive shock charge that 30 people cannot stop objectively. So that makes you understand a lot. Probably there was a way to stop elephants conceptually. The way to kill elephants is actually piercing their butt, literally. I mean, that's the only way you can knock an elephant out. In India, they also used fire arrows, telling the truth, and but an elephant is a pretty unstoppable force unless you develop some particular type of equipment. I don't know, the Macedons had their own sarissas, for example, but still things are less simple than they actually are, and also less scopable. Like, what the hell happened in these battlefields? Well, nobody knows. Nobody can know. You also have to admit this all the time. When we study these things, we have literally no proof of what happened there. We have witnesses, we have hints, but nobody that is alive today was there to tell us, and we should stay humble, right? And just trying to make good hypotheses that can't fit broadly this strength ratios, right? The concept here is when you think about even if elephants and chariots are so few compared to infantry, for example, still they are in ratios that are pretty damn high, and infantry was terribly cheap, as we've seen. Cavalry was not, especially in India, at least. Well, elephants, yeah, were largely available, but horses not, and still elephants costed a freaking lot. So the fact that there were also lots of horses for chariots, there is also this fact that chariots were so present also because cavalry probably was not, there were local horses actually, but they weren't that good, and maybe, it was better to use them in that other fashion, but it's not all. In my opinion, it doesn't stop to that as a factor. There's also a lot of military edicts that emphasizes the heroic chariot culture, like in other tribal cultures, imbued with this idea of the champion, of the caste of warriors, warrior professionalism, etc., and status and aristocracy, etc. So the fact that in Indian armies you find overall, however, this consistent mounted troops, makes you understand, these guys were making a terrible effort to produce it and keep it on the field, and this means that it was pretty damn effective. So it shouldn't be underestimated. Infantry, we have no evidence from Indian infantry at this point to have been anything like the phalanxes in the West. Not even the Achaemenid infantries, aside from mountaineers and other troops, were that much, and still they weren't this solidly ordered lines. Of course, militias actually, we're talking about in large numbers, right? There was militia, but there wasn't this orderly system for which the idea of the citizen soldier, of thick, compact spear formations that nobody could split. That was partly a product of Western wealth distribution ratios that had produced it. If you want, also in less stratified cultures and societies, by a certain standard. And these ones were different, and if you can afford a mounted trooper here, you're most likely to use it. And even if infantry is stronger, definitely in the ancient world, than cavalry, still Indian warfare shows us that there was an enormous importance of this element for sedentary standards. In Indian infantry, surely there were picked bodies. Different imperial guards were even heavy infantry, other than just cavalry, of course, and they were armored. But the wide majority of Indian infantry was not actually, and these masses of troops must be considered like levies, and with not even a particular cohesion on average, though. But still, we have no evidence of heavy infantry perceived as a decisive political, social element of Indian, Indian culture and warfare as a consequence. differently from, I don't know, the Macedonians or the Greeks or the Romans, right? So it's a different world. This doesn't mean, however, what does this mean though? Is that it means that probably Indian society was so stratified. There were a few powerful people. This case is the priesthood and the military, chiefly, that would rule over this enormous amount of peasants, at least in the great valleys of the Indus and the Ganges especially. But all around there were kind of tribal entities. India had this great civilization, but as we've seen, India is huge. So other areas like the Deccan, as we've seen, but also the far north in the mountains, have not developed massive cities, for example, or other entities that could give such a structured order. They were mostly tribes, right? Monarchies made up, of clans and their retinues, etc. And that's mostly a tribal culture. So they fight as, I don't know, the Iranian mountaineers would have fought, as the Celts would have fought. Conceptually, not that, of course, there were many differences in that regard as well. But, you have to think of the ancient world military being composed mostly and prevalently by this average guy who is essentially a javeliner slash melee trooper with a spear that is also a lance, basically 2 or 3 of that, a shield, and a very few, if not any armor. If not, maybe things like thick linen, something like that. And that's the average infantry warrior that you have, because also in here we don't quite have soldiers conceptually. I think, you have soldiers as mercenaries. It was full of contractors, but they were imbued still with a strong warrior and heroic mindset that is not the intelligently ordered and rationally trained trooper, right? There was training, but we don't have a terrific evidence of this in overall, and even the Greeks didn't think much in the sense of these troopers, even though certain Indian texts say, there was this intense training, but in terms of, it was probably mostly about certain picked troops that were kind of ultra hyper trained, individual military men. And we will see that in fact this idea of the champion warrior is still pretty much framed into the monarchic military, in terms of, especially of bodyguards. But the rest of the troops would be like this, in fact, inferior element, considered as such, not just military speaking, but politically and socially. And that's what made the difference, right? More than else. And naturally, cavalry. It would be terrific to see the importance of this element in here, and consider that in the northwest of India, if you look even at places like Taxila, etc., if you go north in the Punjab or in Kashmir, these places, you realize that from the other side of the mountains, there are the Scythians. There is this very powerful military culture that produces cavalry. And cavalry was well equipped and well trained, etc. And India maintained historically the relation with these areas. Essentially, India's conquerors would come mostly from there, and most of the times actually failing. The India wasn't even conquered later on by the at least, well, it depends. They didn't all fail, but let's say that they were soon reabsorbed by the Indian system, culturally speaking. So, but I don't know, the Mongols didn't conquer India, for example. They tried, and don't talk about the Mughal, because those came later. So it's very fascinating, but always think that there were equestrian elements imbued with a sense of heroic military ethos that resembles so much the same Aryan one that had made Vedic culture and established that very system of castes and military professionals, etc. And that who had maintained a memory, an idea of such military cultures, right? So, and of this intensive training that very status required and allowed you to so as well to have, because these guys owned a lot, also materially speaking. So, talking about the organization proper, how were units organized, and what was the organic of the Mauryan armies. So the Mahabharata gives this basic unit or patti of 1 chariot, 1 elephant, 3 cavalry, and 5 infantry, right? And this is probably very ideal. 3 pattis made a senamukha, 3 of these are gulma, 3 of these are gana, 3 of these are vaini, 3 vainis are pratana actually, 3 pratanas are kamu, 3 of these are anikini, and 10 anikinis and aksauhini, right? Which would be an impossible horde of 21,870 chariots. Same number of elephants, and calculate just what the cavalry would be. Thrice cavalry, so 60,000 cavalry and 100,000 infantry. So this is not real. But once again, we can see this 3 base of 3, 3, 3, 3, except from the last rank, which is of 10 times. A ternary base is not extremely frequent, but it's still possible. Decimal base being much more widespread. The Arthasastra claims that each chariot or elephant that are equated in this sense is accompanied by 5 cavalry and 15 infantry. So this is a bit lower than the Mahabharata in terms of cavalry importance, but that's still very meaningful, because it tells you that at the time of, the Mahabharata represents the heroic times, when cavalry probably had a much greater importance, right? So here, for the Mahabharata, basically you have as many cavalry as infantry, right? Which even more actually, because if you consider the chariot is manned and the elephant is manned by more soldiers, you have actually a superior number of cavalry plus crew to infantry, right? So this probably echoes the Vedic, hence Aryan, hence nomadic warfare, its memory. While the Arthasastra is kind of more realistic, more updated if you want, and still shows you, as we were saying before, a substantial importance of cavalry. Like here we have 1 chariot or elephant plus 5 cavalry. So we already have, basically, considering a crew of 3, 8 cavalry plus crew altogether, and 15 infantry, right? So cavalry has a massive importance. If you study this in other historical periods, normally armies that are built like this are mostly kind of course, aristocratic, almost feudal in character, or at least they have a very high number of professionals, and that most of the times, in front of a largely disarmed population, of a political subservient population, are the ones who dominate the battlefield, right? And always bear in mind, this is the Mauryans. Maybe in the Deccan it wasn't like that. In fact, we will see later that in the Deccan, for example, there was much more infantry than that, also elsewhere in the north. So for the Arthasastra, these chariot units, because this group that we have mentioned here is basically conceived like a chariot unit. So the chariot is the single most important element. Is usually to be arrayed in groups of 9. So this would correspond actually to a company, if you think about it, because we are between 150, 100 and 250, let's say. Then 5 of these groups making a chariot division, the Rata Viula, that counted 45 chariots, 225 cavalry, and 675 infantry. And however, even for the Arthasastra, the number of chariot units in a division could vary. Elephant units, instead, because the two things here in the Arthasastra were distinguished, and this is also very interesting because it sounds as if, differently from the Mahabharata, that was a greater, rationalization in the organization of these units. Also because objectively, even if like, just to make you understand what I mean, is that of course elephants have to be used in different ways in which chariots are used, and if you couple in a single unit elephants and chariots and cavalry and infantry, yeah, okay, it all depends on the array, on which enemy you have to fight, whatever, but you basically chain the chariots use, at least, and all the rest of the units use to what the elephant does. So it's obvious that in the military practice on the field, the elephants would kind of be separated from the rest of the troops. And this also widens, by the way, the front of the charge, so that you can use them from different directions, a more extended front that also allows you to operate more. So the difference between the Mahabharata and the Arthasastra could reflect the difference between an initial kind of tribal but mostly in fact an aristocratic but organized warfare, but there were many bands that put together, each one their own elephant from their own clan, let's say, but they were separated into a centralized empire now that can rationalize the military organization and separate these tactical elements, using them in a different fashion. So this is very important, right? And it kind of makes sense, in my opinion. So elephant units, however, were used as with the same numbers of cavalry and infantry as well for the Arthasastra. So naturally, elephants do not go out there alone. They have to be defended, protected. We definitely know in parallel Hellenistic Warfare was basically like that. Elephants need to be guarded on the sides, on the flanks, right, by usually light infantry and possibly also cavalry. So there is nothing strange about this, but it's possible that still, and this could actually tell us that the way elephants and chariots were used was relatively similar, and practically, probably not identical, but still even more similar in the way they were supported by the rest of the army. So this tells us anyway that at the time of the Maurya, apparently, still the shock function of these either the elephants or the chariots was the key for the control of the field, right? And this is very important because still you rarely find this elsewhere, culturally speaking. You find it just in cavalry dominated troops, because all the other, now Hellenistic warfare was based on the hammer and the anvil and of respectively cavalry and infantry, but kind of operating on different levels of the line. Here it seems like whatever the line was, elephants and chariots had still the first place, right? This was not a It definitely reflects political and social segmentation in many ways. And always remember this, it's a matter of culture. There was a military caste that probably was what cavalry was about, largely at least, or decisively, if not numerically, qualitatively on the field, that had this primacy of honor, of charging first, of the shocking the enemy, whatever. Naturally, tactical interaction between the mounted element and the one on foot can be more dynamic, and it always is. But still, this precedence is to be noted. All right. So we also don't know whether the same Arthasastra was thinking of a previous ideal model where all this mounted element had greater importance. In fact, we should be very cautious at dealing with this text as actual evidence, right? And we could technically think that these separations were administrative, mostly, within the army, which means that maybe this was just the way these troops were recruited, not how they were employed on the field. So it's possible at that point there could be even a line infantry with nobody in the front, and I don't know, cavalry and elephants on in other positions. We will see this better when we'll talk about actual Mauryan tactics, Indian tactics of this period in general. But this we don't know that better, and still we know it from outsiders that can be more objective, but still may not tell us exactly what happened, especially in India, when these armies fought actually against each other, like so, with identical composition. While if they fought against Alexander the Great, probably they had to invent kind of a different array because they saw that the enemy was different. So even fighting in a different way to the one they were accustomed, in theory. So or that at least was influenced by it. There are other sources, though, that indicate more simply a decimal organization, 10, 100, and 1000 as number of the units, which actually are probably closer to reality, because it's simpler, right? But it's not necessarily the reality, and this is the point. And in other parts, the same Arthasastra mentions groups of 1 chariot, 5 cavalry, and 15 infantry in tens and hundreds. Right. So this is interesting because it shows a different picture. It shows small units made by this coupling of chariot, cavalry, and infantry, but still the broader units being of different proportions together. And also in here, it could reflect administrative repartitions. We don't know, right? As we were saying before, leading the army was a matter of honor, prestige, like in all political organizations. But here it was the emperor or the kings that led the army in battle. So there is this strongly warrior ethics, warlike ethics that is stressed, for example, by the Brahmin texts that celebrated the local kings as long as they supported the religion, while, for example, Buddhist texts stress much more the administrative, kind of legal functions of the sovereign. So the traditional culture of India was the one. It was warlike. The king was leader of men, was a warrior, and that's what the Vedic legacy had been about. The Arthasastra assumes that the king will lead his own forces, leaving to a regent to govern the kingdom in his absence. So this means that, of course, the king was not was present not just symbolically on the field, but also he would go on campaign for quite a long time. However, we also know that kings like Porus and Ambi of Taxila both led their own armies at the time of Alexander, or by a son or grandson, if they were too old, right? This is important because also the Persian military culture and tradition had actually stressed the contrary, like the king had to rule his army even if he was old, but the reality of nature is different. Cyrus the Great led his army when he was so old, right? And so that was still a model, right? It's obvious that the more advanced states at least had a sophisticated military bureaucracy, while the others would have simpler form of organization. That the complexity of these structures naturally depended not just on the available resources, but also on the political needs. Like how is that you put this army on the field? What's society made of? You have to look at always at these two keys in order to understand what the army is about. The Seleucid ambassador Megasthenes describes the Mauryan administration involving 30 functionaries divided in 6 boards of 5 members each, responsible respectively for the fleet, commissariat, infantry, cavalry, chariots, and elephants. Right? Interestingly enough, the Mauryans had fleets, mostly fluvial ones, as far as I understood, that were definitely very important for controlling all the Ganges Valley, the Indus Valley, but probably they had a navy that controlled the coasts, etc., the trade routes, and so on. And we know astonishingly few about this fleet, unfortunately, but it's still very meaningful that such power, especially when they encompassed all of India, of course it would need this control of waterways for the same wealth of the empire. At that point, India is surrounded by the Indian Ocean and has these 2 major rivers, and their control couldn't be left in the hands of local powers, of pirates, etc., smaller entities that would erode the tax income of the empire. So it's also very interesting that there is a further control over the general administration of the army, and that infantry, cavalry, chariots, and elephants all have their own board. This seems to strengthen, especially from the Hellenistic source here, that in fact there was a real segmentation within the army, that these arms were not considered as complementary as simple units of troopers, but they corresponded all to different political and social backgrounds, right? And it's as if each one of them had its own identity, his esprit de corps, etc., which in an integrated system, arms system, is quite not the case. But this probably reveals, it's another proof of the caste division, as well, however, of the control of the imperial administration on its own military resources, right? Especially on the elephants, in my opinion, because the elephants naturally are, there's not really a caste who owns elephants in this sense, I presume. It's mostly a saddle matter. Elephants cost a lot, and that's what only big states can afford, also in terms of organizing their logistics. And here it's not a problem of calling these troops, it's a problem of putting them together and maintaining them together on campaign, which without an effective logistical system that you have You need an administration to organize, to set up. You don't bring anywhere. So this is really a mighty force here, because there is a scientific repartition of all these arms that deal with their own interaction and maintenance, etc. And this is all the more interesting when you consider that the Arthasastra doesn't quite correspond to this, because it says something different. However, it still gives individual superintendents of horses, elephants, chariots, and infantry, and also an overall commander with responsibility for all military affairs under the king. So even if we don't have the exact correspondence of the two texts, still we see that they both agree on the fact that there was a general control of these various arms under a same supervision. Also, this overall army commander is a very interesting figure, because he is kind of the military the head of the army, and the one who has to respond directly to the king, right, about military affairs. And so this is an important proof also of a further hierarchization of the control of the military instrument. Interestingly enough, and this speaks also a lot about the power of the Mauryan state, horses, weapons, and other equipment, at least the one the regular corps of the army was provided with, were property of the state and not of the individual soldier. This is very interesting, because albeit we can't believe in here that the cavalry, for example, that was made, the elite cavalry was surely made here by the aristocracy, right? So the aristocracy had, for example, its own horses, right? The state could control, of course, the purchasing of more herds and stuff like that from abroad, etc. But still, the local aristocracies would have their own means, their own private armies in part. But still, probably this reveals an effort from the Mauryan side to at least create a permanent army that could counter in part the same aristocracies, so to create an army a bit on its own. And this could in part be paralleled by the attempt to spread Buddhism, especially under such a great conqueror like Ashoka, because expanding military power, something you need, first of all, a great effort to, but you need also a control on your conquests. You need, theoretically, some assurance that you don't conquer these lands just to entrust them to a private that will at one point rebel to you. So creating a kind of a statal army that at least operates in parallel with the private ones that traditionally made up the Indian armies is crucial for trying to maintain a unity, a cohesion of this empire, this dominion that in fact, however, failed at some point. The interesting thing is also that this all in play entails a military administration with depots and warehouses, and also weaponry and armor production. In fact, armorers, bowyers, so forth were directly employed by the state. There were specialized craftsmen that produced these weapons for the state that eventually were distributed to the settled army. Armor, bows were terrifically important in Indian warfare. The Indian longbow was a big thing. It was practically the most important element of infantry, let's say, and it was terrifically effective. It also speaks for the necessity of stopping power that this big masses of infantry could achieve by shooting all together, creating this massive volume of fire with this enormous bows. The only truth, if you look at them, as an anti-cavalry weapon, right? If these guys lacked maybe the cohesion and the fact that this investment in technology is quite important, because you understand that the state was equipping this presumably peasants and not even not belonging to the military caste, the kshatriya, right, as a kind of an anti-noble weapon, right, as it was like even in the Middle Ages, the idea that you can equip these guys to stop knights, right? Consider that the kshatriya, the class of warriors in etymologically speaking, means the protector of the gentle people. Gentle meaning like the gentilhomme, right? This is the chivalric culture of the Veda that had remained in here, putting a lot of emphasis on horses, on cavalry. So here the state is equipping a statal army to potentially counter and deal, in fact, with the aristocracy. And there were revolts, like the Mauryan times under Chandragupta and under Ashoka are remembered largely as, positive, prosperous times, but there were revolts as well. This whole system was pretty unstable overall. Yes, these guys had an amazing administration, but it doesn't mean that they actually controlled, like, literally all of India directly. The coercive means of the times were the ones that they were. So there was this core, of course, of represented by the Indus and Ganges valleys, where the Maurya maintained the greatest military control of its assets, its resources, and then the rest was mostly deterrent power and decentralized government at some point, right? There were garrisons, of course, scattered, whatever, but also always think that military systems usually work economically speaking. They don't spend like everything they have. They can't squeeze too much in this economy, even if India has this potentially infinite amount of resources. Well, in actual fact, they are finite. They or at least they do cause political and social changes, and these rulers have to be mindful of, and that we have seen would bring also to their end at one point. So it was not a laughing matter, and so looking at this hints makes us understand how these guys were making, of course, the most rational choices, benefits ratio, and that was pretty meaningfully and this is pretty meaningfully showing an attention towards centralization, of course, but also certain types of technology and statal control over the armored forces that was aimed to maximize its own power overall. And the fact that this army was taking a profession that probably already had traditionally, but that also kept developing towards a professional direction, is the fact that the peasantry was actually not called up to fight. So even if this is theoretically debatable, like, of course, there were peasants of some sort that would have been armed in some occasion, but theoretically they were not allowed arms because of the caste division, and they couldn't. Arms were prerogative of the conquerors, of the guys who were warriors, because the deity had decided so. So this is not really a matter of... this is something that in India had ongoing forever since the Aryan migration, and the whole society was already oriented, specialized in this way. After all, you have this rich surplus that can allow to who controls this amount of resources to effectively disarm the majority of the people that can cause turmoil and trouble, right? And there is this idea that in during the internal Indian warfare, peasants were also left unmolested, which I really doubt of, because I don't think that it makes any sense strategically speaking, and I don't know any other context in the world in which this didn't happen. But theoretically, there was this idea that, at least from an ideal point of view, war had to be between the great nobles, right? That the nobles had all the prestige of warfare, and that they had theoretically to fight only against each other without touching their own property and so on. But it's unrealistic in my opinion. Because it's still what theoretically it would have been chivalry in feudal Europe, and we know that feudal warfare was barely more than just pillaging the countryside. So it's quite important to understand that, of course, this massive agricultural resources also had an end, and attacking the peasantry, those who worked the land, was a pretty effective way to weaken someone's power, to undermine it. And this is how it effectively happened. Also because at that point, well, you could say, well, but there was so much that probably didn't make a difference. Well, possibly as well, but let's be honest, these were still kind of weak system, pre-industrial societies. Wars weren't anything light that you could go on forever without having damages. It's important. The same collapse of the Mauryan Empire at one point was the cause also of other powers to arise. So that tells us that the control in these lands passed through, of course, the capacity of influencing the local communities, and could reverse also the balance of power. So agricultural resources were important. Probably this picture was more real, in fact, in the Indus-Ganges valleys, but not elsewhere, of course. So this is also what partially the same Mauryan deterrence was. It's obvious that even these masses of agriculturists were pretty, they were disarmed, but technically still there were masses of people, and it was a good thing, to keep them at bay in a way or another, even if they were disarmed, right? These were not systems that could literally disarm everyone, or prevent revolts. It was just the elite for real, right? It was always a shade, and probably also in here Mauryan culture was, like the Indian culture, wasn't tributing to these powers, to these peasants, the real force they could theoretically have. The backbone of the army, however, was made up by the hereditary troops, the members of the kshatriya warrior nobility class. So these provided all the four arms in practice, at least in theory, but we know it is not true in reality. There was a lot of non-warrior nobles that actually made up the actual forces, right? These probably provided the bulk of the army, of the elite one, the professional one, the one that both the emperor, the kings, and the other nobles relied on a regular basis as private retinues or a statal army. But there were lots of other masses were involved into fight that, like militia or levy troops. Levy maybe is not the proper term, because the levy, if you want, is already a Western concept for where, at least let's be honest here, because there were levies also in India. proper, because there were sometimes entire populations that considered themselves entirely free. So as if they all belonged to the kshatriya. The kshatriya was obviously more structured, more hierarchical, socially speaking, in fact, once again, in the great river basins, right? When they owned more wealth, but in other regions it wasn't like that. So in here, India varied wildly on the actual composition of the army, right? But we can say that there were other elements, let's say in the Mauryan army, that were non-warrior noble class and that functioned mostly as militia. There is an account of the Buddha, for example, visiting 4 villages of hereditary infantry, cavalry, chariot, and elephant warriors proper. This probably reflects, Buddha comes much before here. I mean, not much, but still somewhat before, when probably this system was more kind of locally based, more tribal, if you want. By the Mauryan era, instead, these were a paid professional standing force. So the concept here is that probably a lot of people joined this force in spite of their origin. Because let's be honest, especially, here we're talking about in the range of thousands. So we can't think, honestly, that this came just because not even the actually the Maurya came straight from a kshatriya, and this is important to think of. They had humble origins, and this is maybe a myth that the same Mauryans borrowed from the Achaemenids, because there is also the story of Cyrus that was, humble, like Genghis Khan would be, so this was a cliche a little bit that mostly pertains to the, if you want, to the step that glorifies the idea that you rise from nothingness, that was kind of realistic in some cases. But in the case of the Maurya, probably wasn't true. They did belong to the kshatriya, but the tradition says otherwise, at least. So this, however, creates some ambiguity that they had to reconcile in a way or another. And probably this was a relatively more modern and secular world than they had been before, right? Even from their own point of view. And whenever you find military professionalism, you do find elements that are levied from in the most different ways, as long as they fight well and they're willing to die for money. You can find these people, and in fact we will see was plenty of contractors, the bands of mercenaries that whose origin was surely not. I mean, yeah, there was probably an aristocratic element as well, but probably their composition was much more free than what the caste system would have theoretically allowed, right? Megasthenes, again, reports that the Mauryan army was a considerable drain on the treasury, not surprisingly. Every power of the period had its largest expenses due to the army. That literally these states were fundamentally about the army. I mean, in terms of infrastructures, yeah, they built, they create channels, the buildings, cities, whatever. But the major expense was constantly the army. It's like the Roman Empire, like any other empire. Like it was, they were built for maintaining this deterrent force, and that fundamentally how they worked. Like the rest just followed. The growth rate here was dramatically low. Anyway, there were cycles, there were systems of consumption that were barely over the survival rate. So nothing to be surprised of. So it was mostly about maintaining this military asset functional so that you could keep the system stable through the threat of fear. We know the Mauryan administration was pretty harsh, right? They could confiscate properties dramatically easily. They were very violent. It's not that human life costed much at the time, and especially in India, with all that demic density, even less, even if it's sad to say, but it is somewhat true even today. Human life does have a cost, and it can be quantified, sadly enough. Then that's how reality works, and then of course we believe something else, rightfully, but these systems were brutal, and we have to be realistic about it. And still our systems are. So, and Megasthenes says, quote, that when they are not on service, they spend, talking about the Mauryan army, however, when they're not on service, they spend their time in idleness and drinking bouts, right? This is very meaningful because it's what we were saying before about the training. The Indian sources actually emphasize training and sophisticated formations. Megasthenes doesn't even mention them, doesn't even mention peacetime training. This is particularly meaningful because it could mean a lot of things, telling the truth. But we don't have time to digress further, but I presume that, in fact, of course, no doubt there was some training, but probably there are two factors to consider. First of all, this army was considerable like an elite, and handling weapons and horses at the end of the war, which happened, indicates that the training was not constant, right? And therefore, all this emphasis on the control of weapons, etc., is diminished, because it means that these troops somewhat lived in a more private fashion, so probably the coercive means of the state could allow to counter. There were surely troops that were given these weapons, that were trained, but there were probably troops that didn't have military experience, and that's what they were trained for. So this emphasis even on the crew, of the attendants, of these warriors that were considered still in a caste fashion by the rest of society, even if the Mauryans tended to kind of control them always more and to kind of soften up a little bit these differences in order not to make the oligarchs raising too much in power and prestige. Makes you understand that these troops, from one side they were already well trained, because they were either military, as military professionals, that's what they did. They're also what they needed the swords and armor for. But at the same time, maybe Megasthenes was right. It wasn't an actual standard of drill and discipline in these armies given by the state in a solid fashion. It was a control of the resources. It was probably also a way. This was seen a form of wealth redistribution as well in the political and social contexts. This cases were needed by the Mauryan army to work, and they wanted to be rewarded with the weapons and with the possibility of bearing weapons even when in peacetime, but for their own, like privately. So there was indeed, this explains partly also the emphasis on war and this whole system and how it worked, the fact that it probably collapsed because why did the Maurya Empire collapse so early? Well, possibly exactly for this reason, and probably they overextended. At the point, there was not much other option than infight. In terms of profit, these guys couldn't be fed anymore, if not by tearing apart the central direction of the state. So yeah, this sounds pretty well. And the same Maurya had emerged from a civil strife, so a very internal strife, let's say, to India in general. But and this is very interesting because it tells you so much about this world, and it tells you so much about the private character of Indian military culture. The idea that these guys thought that the state probably wasn't quite of a real thing. I mean, it's remarkable because actually what the Mauryans done is an exception in some way. I mean, the Indian history does see the rise of these empires that usually don't last very much. They have this exploit and then they soften up and they get overthrown at one point. But still, the stability. Of course, these were more primitive times. So what the Mauryans did was amazing, and their attempt to centralize and to head this system towards a bit more of a centralized direction is really remarkable. But it couldn't be done outside the military culture of the traditional military culture. Let's put it in this way, and that's why the Buddhist attempt failed. That's why the Brahmins took over once again, because even if the base was too strong to be sensibly altered, and the organization of the army speaks for this a failed attempt, right? So, and talking about mercenaries at this point, there was a statal army, but the second principal source of manpower were these contractors, who possibly were also of much higher quality. You know, why bothering yourself with training so many troops, right? In part because you needed some of yours that could be reliable, that could put up some, form even a sort of representative power of the sovereign, whatever. In part because you needed these aristocrats to participate to the army anyway, to share the power. But as an option, you could buy private soldiers. There were often, as we've seen, maybe other aristocrats, but also other troops, and however they were prize troops, because India was a freaking mess, and these powers were constantly fighting each other, and there, as a consequence, it was full of contractors, of veterans, of military professionals. And in fact, these troops were considered by the same Westerners as the best fighters among the Indians. And these troops traveled from one city to another, usually as they were needed, and they defended their clients and with vigor. And the same Alexander suffered heavy losses from them. So, if the majority, or at least many mercenaries would be part of the kshatriya caste, there were also adventurers of diverse origin, right? They could be fugitive nobles, Brahmins, so even parts of the priests, right? But also weavers, taking service as archers, because they had these corporations, these artisans had also the technical know-how to build certain technologies and to use them, etc. So this is very interesting and fascinating, because you realize that in this cauldron was plenty of people from very diverse background, beyond the caste division. And at one point, a Brahmin, as we've seen, the Brahmins are the top class in India, the most important one, the most sacred. He even became an archer's servant. So, the top class, even superior to one of the soldiers that, fights basically for a soldier's serve. That, but it did happen. And this system was so complicated, we can barely imagine how messed up it actually was. However, as we were saying before, hereditary troops and mercenaries, at least, usually had servants. Right, an Indian army at the time would be accompanied regularly by a vast tale of non-combatants, like all armies at the time, but still reflecting, let's say, the need for attendance, for soldiers who were pretty damn good, right? If you need attendance, yeah, you can be someone softened up by wealth or whatever, but this speaks also for some sort of quality like what do you do on a campaign for with your own attendants if you don't even fight, if you don't have expensive armor, if you don't at least show off? And there was still this heroic military ethos for which the champion went in battle with its attendants, etc., and it was deeply felt at the time. The infantry that made up largely this non-combatants, albeit I'm sure that there would be attendants on horseback as well, were mostly archers. At least it seems, as we were saying before, that largely equipped with bows in different, many, probably the majority of them would be spearmen actually, but the Alexander at one point hired some troops known in Greek as the Assakenoi in the sources, that however were the Ashvakas or Asvakayanas or Asvayanas, and sometimes Latinized as, in fact, Asacheni, Asakani, were people who lived in what is now northeastern Afghanistan and the Peshawar Valley. Now this is a very different background from the Indus and Ganges valleys, but they, in fact, those are lands of mountaineers where there are pretty damn good javelin, historically speaking. So that's just an example. However, of a relatively of an Indian force that, Indian nominally, but still part of a kind of a Logian military culture in part. But archers were largely present in India, as far as we understand, among the infantry. There were also mercenary cavalrymen. Mercenary chariots and elephants are unlikely, but probably there was a traffic, at least of chariots proper. Like, there weren't probably mercenary charioteers, albeit probably many of these warriors could fight, did know how to fight in a chariot, and probably a traffic of elephants, right, for military use and training. So this, even building the chariot, for example, had all probably an artisanal spin-off that was connected to military activity as well, military market. It would be interesting to know more about that. What about external, non-Indian mercenaries? Well, seemingly there was a very few. This is interesting because obviously the Indians were by themselves quite of a demographic power, so maybe there were external. Surely there were foreign mercenaries, but they were maybe too few compared to the amount of people that lived in India. The troops that you could find there. So no, at least in this period, non-Indian mercenaries are rare, right? However, it's been suggested that Chandragupta might have been provided by Alexander with some troops, maybe even Greeks. Some even go as far as saying, Chandragupta conquered the Indian throne, let's say, with phalanges. Well, no, the Indians didn't. We don't have any proof they did that, and they were too far from that, from the Hellenistic military culture to come to produce a system like that. But surely there were mercenaries coming from Alexander's army. That was a quite multi-ethnic army, especially at the point when Alexander arrived in that context. And consider the Indians had fought even at the Gaugamela, for example. So they fared as well as mercenaries, and it's very interesting. Most of the Indian elephants that were used in later Hellenistic armies, of course, came from India, and there were some breeds in North Africa too, but also it's difficult. Sometimes there were Indians as well. Even the Ptolemies at one point used we use Indian elephants, but the Mahouts also, more importantly, were Indians. Like, I don't know, the elephants that Pyrrhus used to invade Italy were were manned by Mahouts, Indian Mahouts. This is particularly fascinating. So there is also this exporting dimension of military, of the Indian military, that, especially in terms of elephants, that were used even as diplomatic gifts. Seleucus the first was gifted with hundreds of as a that were very important eventually for his later success. And but the thing I was saying is that even after Alexander, or even during Alexander's times, Chandragupta received help from Alexander's governors in the Punjab as well. That also had, of course, they had their own military culture. So the Mauryans would get rid of this Hellenic avamposts in India, but the Hellenic mercenary guardsmen, artillerists, and engineers might have probably been hired by the Indians as well. In fact, there is all a debate even in saying, did the Mauryans or even previous powers like the Nanda had used artillery siege engines? Well, we have I think a later source that claims that the Nanda had used some stone projecting machinery for siege warfare, but I think there's no proof actually that it's a later evidence. But I mean, even in the Bible, it's written from later times that there were stone projecting weapons, but there is no actual proof that before the Philip the Second of Macedon, actually anyone had used torsion catapults and stuff like that. So if anything, it's the other way around. In this period, however, we have no evidence of artillery in Mauryan use. I mean, there is no clear perception of this, even though it's possible that, of course, siege warfare was developed enough to the point of even having this Macedonian advisors that might have experimented something with Mauryan funding. Maybe, who knows? But there is no direct evidence of this. It's obvious that later references do talk about these things, but at that point they might have been easily influenced by, in fact, what current state of affairs was in other areas of the world, and not quite reflecting what the reality was locally. Another source of manpower were the guild troops, that were essentially local militia belonging to local corporations that could be of different background. For example, they could be guilds of bodyguards. I mean, literally, bodyguards could, in this aristocratic society, where it was plenty of noblemen, could form entire guilds on their own. Could be private military associations, like contractors, even for protecting, I don't know, caravan guards, for example. That is professional fighters, but non-regular troops, employed by, not just by noblemen, but also by merchants, and that could be levied up in wartime. And even in here, drawing a line between who was who in peacetime or wartime, it doesn't make much sense. After all, maybe it was the same startled troops that, in peacetime used their weapons provided by the state to do that, as we have seen, to live like that. And that made part of the training. A note on the training that I didn't say before, because what I just said, even before, may sound contradicting, but if there wasn't a great discipline and drill, etc., but you say now that these were military professionals, knew their business, were good at doing it. Yeah, but when you have an enormous army and you don't have collective training, that's a problem. You can have highly trained professionals of war that fight as small bands, but know nothing about how to keep formations uh, in order. Like, obviously, it's not difficult actually even here to find someone like that. If it's an army of 10,000 men, plausibly, who was used to war business knew how to maintain discipline, right? The problem, though, is when a state has to organize massive military expeditions, and this requires a collective discipline but not just for the fight in itself, but even just for sake of command, of using detachments, maintaining communications. It's difficult, right? So once again, when you find a weak public power by certain standards in a strong private power by certain standards, it's usually because collective training is kind of poor, but individual training is kind of high. And this is, I think, a decent picture, but I don't want to underestimate Mauryan capabilities as well, because such enormous numbers, yes, are obviously, when you have too many troops, it's also more difficult to keep them together, even if you have a high military standard as a power. So actually, these large numbers maybe can speak for maybe something more. Maybe these numbers are inflated by the fact that there were so many attendants, so many civilians, by the fact that such great powers would be sustained by largest amount of people in general that had all interests to back them, etc. But maybe the fighting force was much smaller in many ways. The fact that sometimes here we've seen that chariots were elephants were much less than infantry, but it may also well be that maybe many of the infantry were not actual fighting force. So yeah, I think this is an option, and still there were these militias that make you think that probably these sovereigns needed to mobilize even troops that didn't quite have any professional military background. Like, there were surely urban militias of the artisan classes that could be organized on the base of craft guilds, like in some the militias in medieval Europe. We've seen the weavers before that were good with bows, so that's quite... and you maybe at a provincial level you could use them. Like, if a city was threatened in its district by, I don't know, brigands, you could send the local militia without moving the army. Maybe, you could send just some mercenary bands to back them, but that's how composite it probably was. I mean, the Mauryas were trying to structure this, to make it a more coherent structure, but and to make it more functional, but at the same time it was pretty difficult to control this system, because it was so multi-headed that was probably very complex to keep under, right? Especially the aristocracy, I give you that, but this other militias, for example, could be effective auxiliary troops, right? As well as, for example, there were troops from the wild forest tribes, certain regions of India that were employed, right? They were especially good for scouting, diversionary attacks, because that's what they knew how to do. So how to do that well, and that's what a great empire does in terms... It's like the Roman Empire. They used more auxiliaries than citizen troops most of the times in their history, actually all the time in their history, and that's... Well, it worked as long as they had this core professional troopers that kind of functioned and was the professional army of a real empire, right? And so, yeah, probably here it was the base that was more messed up. It was the political and social base, the absence of a concrete state. It's not the Maurya left, this enormous civic legacy, like, I don't know, the Romans or the Han in China could have done, right? These were relatively more private systems, in my opinion, that fragmented, in fact, lasted less than others, and this is meaningful in my opinion. but it still tells you that the vitality of the local tissue was so high that was the same cause of their collapse. So there was private military organization as well, and that's the real problem for a state that wants to control, to pacify. That hence Buddhism. That's why they tried to go towards Buddhism towards the end. The Brahmins kicked them out, and the nobility backed him as well. So it's pretty meaningful and coherent as a picture, in my opinion. There were also properly foreign troops in the sense that there were private kings that were maybe clients of the Mauryas, but were not part of the Mauryan Empire as the Mauryan state. Let's say better. So yeah, and these troops would be employed with their own officers, and this is also what the Romans did, for example. Yeah, and even deserters from enemy armies would be occasionally employed, right? So, this is a messed up but still coherent picture, and messed up in the sense that it's chaotic, apparently, and also problematic in political and military bargaining terms, but still it kind of makes sense overall. And now, after the Mauryas, let's focus also on the regional realities that existed all around in the Indian subcontinent because of this massive dimension of it, right? In the northwestern mountain tribes, for example, including Iranian elements that participated to Mauryan armies as well. There are the Indians whose customs Herodotus said were like those of the Bactrians and the mountain Indians, and Paramisai, whose cavalry fought brigaded with the Aracosians at Gaugamela and elsewhere, right? These regions of the north, for the same nature of the home terrain, didn't produce much cavalry and chariots. Also, elephants were rare, and both because of the nature of the country and because they simply didn't breed there. I mean, they had to be imported from the south. Also, the hill tribes weren't that rich, so the elephants are probably here the greatest indicator of a statal presence. Like, only big rich states can afford the elephants, especially in large numbers. For example, the Asakenoi, the Asvakas that we described before, fought Alexander with some only 30 elephants, 2,000 cavalry, 7,000 Indian mercenaries, so coming from India proper, and 30,000 infantry. Right, so here you understand that cavalry is much less important. And it's a more contained number, especially elephants. Like, it's 1 over 1,000 compared to the infantry. There is also this other areas of the Punjab and I think also partly the Deccan areas that had not adopted the monarchic system, that had remained oligarchic republics, ruled by a freeman class, claiming sort of common descent and caste status. This is the most important, most fascinating thing in my opinion. While the head of the army would be, and of the state actually, would be some elected officers. This is very fascinating because it resembles what the Vedic, like the Aryan tradition had been. So tribes, like tribal kingdoms with freeman warriors coming, with very high ethnic cohesion, apparently, that claim to belong still to in fact, to the warrior class of freemen, right? To the idea that, the caste that in other areas of India was just one of the others, here basically encompassed the whole people, which means that they were all freemen, or at least with some slaves and serfs, but still claiming the fact that they weren't, they had never, they still belonged to the stock of the ancient conquerors. This is very important because it reflects obviously the lesser stratification of these peoples. In fact, they had a more kind of tribal warfare in their own regard. Alexander met some of these kingless peoples, especially in the Punjab, for example, the Malloy, the Katayoi, and the Oxidrakai. And for basically all the existence of the Mauryan rule remained fundamentally independent. Some of them would emerge actually as independent peoples after the fall of the Maurya. For example, the Arjunayanas and the Yaudayas. What is interesting about these armies is that there are no elephants. Yes, there is no elephants, and for example, the Malloy had something like between 90,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and 900 chariots. The Agalasses, 3,000 cavalry and 400 infantry. The Sambastai, 6,000 cavalry, 6,000 infantry, and 500 chariots. So what immediately comes to evident is that there are no elephants. Also, the chariots are less in number than the average. There's still an important presence of cavalry, right? But mostly we're talking about infantry, right? And pretty balanced armies, after all, in favor of this freeman class. Very important, like freemen in terms at this point of middle class, let's say better, because obviously you realize here cavalry and chariots still are made up by the nobility, but these are much more tribal powers that probably do not have elephants, not just for geographical reasons, maybe in some cases, but for the fact that probably were not as stratified as the greater powers. And for example, for the Katayoi, we know that when they fought against Alexander, they had cavalry, chariots, infantry, no elephants, and the Greeks were interested in elephants, so in their stories they wrote about these, and as also in this case one of the most prominent features of the local warfare that was characterized by these animals that were pretty impressive, right, for the Westerns. And the Greeks were even counting like elephants were as few as 15 or 30. So when we talk about this kingless states and we deduce that it had no elephants, you realize that no king, no elephant, right? It sounds weird, but it objectively makes sense, because the upkeep of war elephants was extremely costly, and only kings could afford it. So these tribes they probably had a high military average in terms of, per warrior. They were probably more warlike societies in general, where you understand even here the heroic military edus was pretty damn high, and in fact they all claimed to have kshatriya status. They all felt themselves to be the ancient, at least the descendants of the ancient Aryan conquerors, and they wouldn't give that up, because even in the political map of India, they felt themselves as, which probably they didn't even conceive at the time, geographically speaking, but they felt themselves as those guys who had remained without anybody telling them what to do. Essentially, this was alive in the ancient Aryan peoples. The distrust towards military, towards monarchs, and the fact that these guys elected their own military commanders in times of war is like, it's something you find like at the time of Tacitus, when the Roman author describes the Germans, to say, they don't have real chiefs, they elect it for war. Of course, there were local small kings and dynasties, etc., but it was still kind of an oligarchic system. And objectively, they did elect some chiefs for the army that, of course, eventually tended to abuse of their own power, like in every circumstance, but still remaining free. And this is not necessarily positive. I mean, of course, this is debatable, because these areas also produced less civilization from one side, but probably they lived maybe better. Who knows? Maybe it was better to be one of these freeman warriors than one of these serfs into the most advanced areas of India. But it's still fascinating to think of this system as a product of a previous domination that had divided this whole world conceptually in castes, and through which you can measure fundamentally the degree of social stratification. It is amazing, right? Political stratification as well. So, yeah, and so they had probably these peoples, and the fact that they're mentioned even by the Hellenic sources as, by name, with this, feeling of themselves, it means that they had an esprit de corps, a greater national, consequently military cohesion than the rather heterogeneous royal armies, for example. Finally, we observe the south of India with the home of the Tamils, right, who emerge in the Mauryan era, organized into several kingdoms: the one of Kolas, Pandyas, Satyaputras, and Kerala Putras. And Megasthenes writes about them, and he says that the Pandyas had 500 elephants, 4,000 cavalry, and 130,000 infantry. Chariots here seemingly were not unknown either. If anything, because Tamil poetry of the early centuries AD mention armed nobles in chariots, but however they were rare. In my opinion, I mean, you see in the north you see less elephants, more let's say no elephants actually. I mean, in those powers of the north, no elephants. Here you find almost no, in the south, almost no chariot. What this means probably is that the north was really influenced more by this Aryan prestige of the warrior that fights on the chariot, like in typical heroic fashion. You can find in the Iliad, in Mahabharata, even the Celtic world, and this idea that it's the guy on the chariot, it's the champion, it's the great fighter. In the south, there were elephants. Evidently, they were used, and probably these kingdoms were not even just... They were fairly powerful in their own regard, even if the far south of India is considered wild and ferocious, in fact, and kind of barbaric. But it seems that this area was less affected by the heroic military culture, if there were fewer chariots, right? Or maybe... who knows, actually... I don't think this was necessarily a less stratified society, for example. There were probably the use of elephants speaks for it, but definitely was not this great emphasis on the idea of the original Vedic stock of the conquerors, etc. Those areas had remained more apart from that, and this could be also due in part by the fact that also horses were more rare, and maybe the territory is kind of more tropical-like. Horses have more difficulties in the south to breathe well. Eventually in India, the Arabs and the Portuguese would import horses, etc., and would have an edge in these southern Indian kingdoms on the battlefield because of it, right? So it would be interesting to learn more about this area. That, however, was still influenced by the Vedic impact. Like even in here, the Aryan military culture had evidently some. At one point, that there is no area of India you can claim to be like here there had been the Aryans and here not. Like it's obvious that in the north it was higher as an influence, but overall, modern Indian culture evolves from that one and the one of the pre-Vedic times, right? So it's important. Obviously, the north is where it's the hub where that remained the most, right? In the south, at least, but still, they're all influenced by that. Relatively to the wild character of the south, the Tamils indeed were very fierce and warlike, even bloodthirsty and ruthless than in the north. There is this idea that in fact the north is more chivalrous, it's more influenced by the Vedic tradition of gallantry and the kshatriya, meaning, as we said, the protectors of gentle people, like medieval knights, because that's what they came from the steppes conceptually in this sense. There was this myth, this idealization, if you want, and there is at least some evidence of possible anthropophagic practices attached right after the victory, during the feasts. Also, there is this interesting presence of, in the Pandyas at least, late in this period, having inner palace guards of armed so-called Hellenic women and outer guards made of male Hellenic mercenaries, but this is just a voice. What is more interesting is Chandragupta actually having disposed of a band of Amazons as his private bodyguard. This is very interesting. Probably this last source reflects that, because here we don't know what these women were, except the fact that they were probably more light-skinned than usual. So, for Indian standards, so it's been speculated that this could be Scythian women, the Massagetae being, led by a queen at one point, against which Cyrus died, the Achaemenid emperor. So we know that during the Alexander's conquest of Persia, the Achaemenid had 100 of this Amazons coming from the steppes, because you know that the Scythian and Sarmatian women were meant to be in part militarized, to be actual warriors. So it's possible. Nobody knows where those Scythian women went after Alexander's conquest of Persia. It could be that Chandragupta actually hired them, and he said that nobody could pass through this bodyguard without being chopped to pieces. So this female presence is very fascinating, and it could be now. I'm not an expert about Indian culture, but there could be some considerations about that, even their religion, and the symbolism that this could have. But it's nevertheless a proof of this continuous contact that existed between Indian military culture. Doesn't matter whether real or hypothetical, ideal, if you want, between the steppe, between the world of the steppe from which the ancient conquerors had come from, that had left this idea of the castes, where all the idea of glory, of military power, and political legitimization came from, and that made this Indian landscape so unique. The more being already the way